So, finally getting around to shooting this last movie vlog, going through some of the last films that I saw in theaters before the pandemic hit. So let's get started with our first movie for today, which is called The Photograph. And if I'm being honest, I don't think I'm ever going to at least entirely understand the appeal of these very dreary romance films, Portrait of a Lady on Fire being the exception, not the rule for me. There is a unique artistry at the core of a movie like The Photograph that does keep its head above water, but this movie was also boring beyond belief. I don't really have anything more to add. I really like the aesthetic. The characters are well sketched and the relationships are believable, but what the movie chooses to do with the relationship between our two protagonists is not only boring, but is diluted into this hazy, non-linear narrative that doesn't feel like it's offering anything new. The movie is certainly pretty, but what is being presented with that prettiness is underwhelming, to say the least. I feel like what little plot this movie has could just be explained in a few words. I get that this movie might be trying to say a lot with very little, but the fact that this film feels as polished as it does seriously compromises the feeling that this is an organic, natural love story. And the whole emotional center of this movie is based around this idea that May's experience in the movie are colored by her mother dying. And however much I respect this movie's willingness to tackle some very heavy themes, it still makes every second feel like a dirge. I don't know if that was intended, whether it's part of the appeal, or what anyone was trying to do with this movie exactly, to be honest. And overall, I'd just say that I like the presentation and the aesthetic enough to say that this is passable, but only barely. This is a very light 6 out of 10. You could probably skip it, take it or leave it. Now on to Fantasy Island, and not gonna lie, I thought this was gonna be a lot worse than it actually turned out being. I certainly wouldn't go as far to call Fantasy Island anywhere close to good, but I can kind of see this film working in the right environment. It's just so dumb. Unfortunately, over-the-top stupidity is not the same as drama, and I'm not entirely sure the writers understood that. As far as the plot goes, in which everyone in the story is allowed to live out a fantasy on this magical island, every fantasy that every character chooses is pretty vague, apart from Patrick and Melanie's, the former of whom wants to get enlisted into the army, and the latter wants revenge on the girl who bullied her as a child. The movie then tries to interweave each kind of fantasy narrative into each other and makes a complete mess as it does so, with the climax at the end seemingly implying that everyone is here for the same reason, with one particular horrific plot twist being particularly clunkily handled. It's a shame because there is potential in the idea, but the execution seems more focused on generic jump scares rather than anything really solid or anything of substance. And they're not even good generic jump scares. When a jump scare works, it's at least making the effort to subvert the audience's expectations in some way or being used to further the plot. Here, any moment that made me jump just felt unbelievably forced. Speaking of forced, the movie makes a habit of continually reminding its audience that it's set on an island and Mr. Rourke has a duty to this island. So with that in mind, you might expect the cinematography and editing to work together as a means of personifying the island, especially as Mr. Rourke continuously addresses the island as if it's a person. Unfortunately, this amounts to nothing. The environment certainly looks good, but the cinematography is doing very little to emphasize it, and it means that I just can't get as invested in the environment in the island as you might expect. For a movie called Fantasy Island. And if you put that alongside one-dimensional character arcs, with Patrick's being particularly one-dimensional, and you have a recipe for yet another painfully mediocre horror movie at best. But there is kind of a charm to the incompetence on display across this movie's far too long running time, almost to the extent that I'm willing to attach the "so bad it's good" label to it. It just feels so ridiculous, crazy, and weird that it kind of becomes endearingly dumb in a way. Make no mistake, this is still a bad film, but if you feel like getting drunk with some friends and watching a stupid horror movie you can laugh at, you could do a lot worse than Fantasy Island. I can definitely see a setting where this movie would work, but outside of that setting, probably give this one a hard pass. A strong 4 out of 10. It has its place, but other than that, not for me. Now onto another one that I've really been wanting to talk about for a while. Vin Diesel stars as the title role in Bloodshot. And while this is by no means one of the worst movies that I've seen this year, trust me, we'll get onto that in a second, Bloodshot is easily one of the most overblown and heartless action movies I've come across recently. As with any movie where the protagonist is more machine than human, the question I always ask is, okay, what is the movie going to do to make me sympathize with such a mechanical character? And in the case of Bloodshot, the answer is not much, basically nothing. Make no mistake, the movie tries to get you to feel something as the narrative unravels and as you uncover more about what the protagonist is going through, but the point stands that if the character at the center of your narrative is basically immortal for most of the movie, not only is it hard for me to get attached to him, the stakes of your movie take a nosedive. And the last thing you'd expect a movie in this vein to do is exacerbate that problem by drenching the action sequences in overblown and pretentious red washes, disgustingly dated CGI and slow-mo effects, not to mention a whole lot of smoke when you just thought the movie couldn't get any more overproduced. And when the movie tries for subtlety, like when Ray finds that Gene has started a family without him, it arguably fails even harder, mainly because subtlety isn't exactly one of Vin Diesel's strengths as a performer. But on that note, subtlety is very much an afterthought in this movie anyway. It's mainly overblown, sugary action. This movie is mostly just delivering overblown action sequences with, again, as I said, some of the worst CGI I've seen in a while. And why, at such an important climax in your movie for the audience, do you choose to drench the scenes in obnoxious red washes that look so artificial it's hard to look at? I get this movie is painting in broad strokes, and yeah, that doesn't have to be a bad thing. Look at Birds of Prey earlier this year. But only if I can get invested in the characters and there's some kind of dramatic stakes that are engaging. And that's what's kind of fascinating to me about this movie. Because, as I said, if you're gonna make your character an unstoppable killing machine, where every injury and wound he sustains is instantly healed and nothing can harm him, so he's really in danger in the movie, I'd be intrigued to see how the movie gets around this and makes me feel something towards the characters nevertheless. But unfortunately, Bloodshot, as I said, doesn't come close to answering this question, as Vin Diesel's character is about as hilariously one-dimensional as it gets. The movie does feel like it's trying at some points, like when it introduces the whole narrative thread that, you know, he's being manipulated, you know, very early on in the movie, into effectively being the bad guy's personal assassin, which might feel like it's got some kind of stakes to it until you realize how horrifically broadly sketched the villain characters are, not to mention hilariously incompetent. The villains in this movie are just so pathetic and useless that it leads to their predictable downfall, in the most melodramatic yet underwhelming way possible. It's not all bad though. Like, I'd give the movie some points of having at least some real energy to it. It might not be good overall, but it's still engaging in short spurts. The problem is, I already have my obnoxious, sugary superhero adjacent movie of choice from earlier this year, Birds of Prey, again as I said earlier. I have no use for this, 4 out of 10, move on. Now on to yet another movie that I've been wanting to discuss for quite a long time, The Hunt. And, yeah, this is the kind of film that makes me wonder why I even bother with horror to begin with. That's right, folks, it only came out in March, but we might have an early front runner for one of the worst movies of the year. The Hunt might seem innocent enough on the surface, but look even just a tiny bit deeper and you might find one of the most immediately detestable horror movies of recent memory. And the crazy thing is, I was not expecting this to be bad at all. And about the last thing I expected was to be faced with almost Black Christmas levels of on-the-nose political commentary, if you even want to dignify this by calling it that. The most tolerable moments in this movie come from those horror comedy moments at the start, as the film mercilessly kills off its characters as a means of vaguely amusing the audience. Just cheap laughs, really, isn't it? Although I still don't like this very much. After all, I prefer my horror to have a bit more grit and stakes to it. And the problem with The Hunt is that there are no stakes. There is no grit, because the bad guys are completely incompetent. Even more so than in Bloodshot. They spend more time talking amongst themselves than fighting, and seem more interested in letting the humans that they are hunting come to them, rather than actually going out themselves and being active. And my first thought was that maybe this was supposed to feed into the whole political angle that this film was trying to take, stereotyping the, like, liberals as being lazy or something like that. But when we have directors like Jordan Peele and Bong Joon-ho working in the same subgenre making films like Us and Parasite, I have to ask, why is there any need for this? And you know when I said earlier that there was not an ounce of grit or stakes in this movie? Well, that's before you realize this is a hunting movie. Like, where this sense of threat is probably quite important. When the hunting begins, the group are hounded with gunfire until the film forces in its cringeworthy comedy elements, and all of a sudden, in that moment, the stakes at least feel vaguely high. And unfortunately, that sense of drama isn't even approached throughout the rest of the movie. It's a horror-adjacent movie without any intensity, drama, or stakes. To the extent that, and this is the part of the movie that really pissed me off, the movie finds time for these ridiculous extended monologues. One of them being Crystal telling some variant of the tortoise and the hare fable that goes on for a stupidly long time. For a film that's trying to create a sense that she is on the run and has no idea who she can really trust, it sure does love taking some time out to undercut its own non-existent drama. But believe it or not, that's not even close to the worst of it, because then you come to the ending of this movie. Sure, the choreography might be pretty decent, even as the pair suddenly stop fighting at random points to catch their breath, severely compromising any kind of tension, drama, and intensity the film wants to try and build. But the emotional climax of this film is not one of triumph or even of defeat. Instead, it hinges on the idea that Crystal was never supposed to be involved in the hunt at all. You see what I mean when I say the bad guys are incompetent? It's hard to expect an audience to be invested in Crystal as a character when who she's up against are a group of characters of the film goes out of its way to represent as completely stupid. And I've not even got into how pretentious this movie is. One of the few interesting things about the writing is how it alludes to George Orwell's novel Animal Farm. It's probably the only part of this movie that suggests any kind of intelligence on the part of the writers, but at the crucial moment, the film makes the mistake of explaining this to the audience. You know, as if we're idiots. Rule number 1 of writing is that unless you have thematic justification for doing so, which this doesn't, you never talk down to your audience. And in that moment where the film felt that it needed to explain its references to its audience, I was half tempted to leave the movie theater and hang myself from the nearest lamppost. Look, I wanted to be as generous to this movie as possible, but everything that it comes close to doing well, it undercuts spectacularly. It's almost enough to make you think this is all a joke, but as far as I can tell, this was intended to be taken entirely seriously. Like, sure, it might be satirical, but it's still a serious movie. It's not like no one cared about this. There was clearly some degree of thought and care and attention put into it. So it clearly was supposed to be taken seriously to some extent. As far as horror comedies that have a social and political message, I'm sticking with Us and Parasite for the time being. As for this is absolutely terrible. I would not be surprised if this stays as one of the worst movies of the year come the end of it. This is a 2 out of 10. You're going to want to avoid this movie like the plague, trust me. And that's it. So next time I'm hoping to cover the last few movies that I saw in theaters, along with a few more. So Military Wives, Misbehavior, Onward, maybe Emma, and yeah, maybe a few more after that. We'll see where we go from here. But other than that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you.